In the winter of 1843, in an isolated parish nestled in the Appalachian wilderness, 11-year-old Margaret Holloway stood before an altar in a ceremony that would later be discovered in church records, documented in her father's own handwriting. The officiant was Reverend Thomas Holloway, her father. The groom was a man whose name appears in those records, but whose face no surviving account can quite describe clearly. What makes this case truly disturbing isn't just what happened that winter night, but what investigators found when they finally entered the Holloway parish house 3 years later, and what Margaret herself testified to in a deposition so disturbing that it was sealed by court order for over a century. The documents were unsealed in 1981, and what emerged was a story that challenges our understanding of reality itself. This isn't just about a crime, though a horrific crime certainly occurred. This is about something far more unsettling, something that the 12 men who investigated the Holloway house in 1846 could never fully explain, and something that Margaret Holloway, in her final days in 1891, still insisted was not quite what anyone believed it to be. The Holloway parish sat 7 miles from the nearest town, connected only by a rough trail that became impassable in heavy snow. Reverend Thomas Holloway had requested this remote posting in 1838, citing a desire to bring God's word to the isolated mountain families scattered throughout the region. He arrived with his wife Catherine, his daughter Margaret, who was then 6 years old, and his son Daniel, who was 14. The parish house was a large, 2-story structure built of dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Attached to the house was a small chapel with room for perhaps 30 congregants, though services rarely saw more than a dozen attendees from the surrounding homesteads. Thomas Holloway was described by those who knew him as intense and peculiar, a man given to long silences and longer sermons. His wife Catherine was remembered as nervous and thin, growing thinner with each passing year. Margaret was described as a solemn child with dark eyes that seemed older than her years. Daniel, the teenage son, was rarely mentioned in any accounts, which itself becomes significant as this story unfolds. The first year at the parish was unremarkable according to the few records that survive. Reverend Holloway conducted services, performed baptisms, and visited the sick in their homes. He kept meticulous records of every religious ceremony in a leather-bound ledger, each entry dated and signed in his precise, slanted handwriting. But in the winter of 1839, Catherine Holloway died. The official record states that she succumbed to pneumonia, a common enough fate in that harsh climate. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the chapel. Reverend Holloway conducted the service himself, and several families from the congregation attended. What's notable is that after Catherine's death, the Reverend's behavior began to change in ways that would only become clear later. He started locking the parish house at night, something he'd never done before. He began conducting private evening services in the chapel, with only his children present, and he stopped accepting social invitations from his parishioners, politely but firmly declining every offer to share a meal or attend a gathering. Margaret was 8 years old when her mother died. According to later testimony from Sarah Hendricks, a woman who lived on a nearby homestead and occasionally brought food to the parish house, Margaret changed after Catherine's death. She became quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped playing like a child and began moving through the house like a small adult, performing chores with mechanical efficiency. Sarah remembered trying to engage the girl in conversation during one visit in the spring of 1840, asking her about a doll she'd seen Margaret carrying months earlier. Margaret had stared at her with those unsettling dark eyes and said, "Father says I'm too old for dolls now. Have important work to do." When Sarah asked what kind of work, Margaret simply turned and walked away, disappearing into one of the upstairs rooms. Sarah recalled feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, a sense that something in the Holloway house had fundamentally shifted, though she couldn't articulate what it was. Daniel, the teenage son, became even more of a shadow after his mother's death. The few times he was seen in town, he appeared gaunt and distracted, speaking only when directly addressed, and then only in monosyllables. A shopkeeper named Henry Walsh remembered Daniel coming to purchase supplies in the summer of 1840 and noted that the boy's hands shook as he counted out coins. When Henry asked if everything was well at the parish, Daniel's eyes had darted toward the door as if checking to see if someone was watching, and he'd muttered something about his father being very devoted to his work before hurrying out without collecting his change. Henry had thought it odd at the time, but hadn't pursued the matter. People in isolated areas respected boundaries, and the Reverend's household was his own business. In the fall of 1841, something happened that should have raised alarms but didn't, not immediately. Daniel Holloway disappeared. The official story, as told by Reverend Holloway to the few who asked, was that his son had gone to live with relatives in Pennsylvania to pursue an education. This was plausible enough. Families often sent children to live with distant relations for better opportunities, but there were no relatives in Pennsylvania, as would later be discovered. There were no letters from Daniel. There was no forwarding address. Daniel Holloway, at 16 years old, simply ceased to exist in any documented form after October. His disappearance left only Reverend Thomas Holloway and his daughter Margaret in the isolated parish house, alone together through the winter months, when snow made the 7-mile trail nearly impossible to traverse. It was during this period, between October 1841 and March 1842, that Margaret Holloway transformed in ways that disturbed the few parishioners who saw her at Sunday services. She had always once a solemn child, but now she moved with a strange formality, as if every gesture had been carefully rehearsed. She sat through her father's sermons without fidgeting, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Sarah Hendricks, who continued to bring occasional supplies to the parish despite her unease, noticed that Margaret had started wearing her hair differently, pulled back severely in a style more suited to an adult woman than a 9-year-old girl. When Sarah commented on this, trying to be kind, Margaret had replied in a flat voice, "Father says I must look proper now. I have a role to fulfill." The phrase "role to fulfill" stuck with Sarah, nagging at her for reasons she couldn't quite name. Reverend Holloway's sermons during this period took on a different character as well. According to the recollections of several parishioners interviewed years later, his topics shifted from general biblical teachings to very specific themes about duty, obedience, and the special role of the family in God's plan. He spoke frequently about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, emphasizing not the intervention of the angel, but Abraham's absolute obedience to God's command. He preached about the sacred nature of covenant, how once a promise was made, it could never be broken regardless of the cost. He talked about purification through suffering and the idea that some souls were chosen for special purposes that others couldn't understand. Old Miss Patterson, who attended services regularly despite the difficult journey from her homestead, remembered feeling increasingly uncomfortable with these sermons, but attributed her discomfort to her own failings rather than anything wrong with the Reverend's teachings. That was how things worked then. You didn't question a man of God, especially not in your own mind. The winter of 1842 to 1843 was particularly brutal. Snow fell heavily from November through March, and the trail to the parish became completely impassable for weeks at a time. The Holloways were entirely cut off from the outside world, living alone in that dark wood house with its attached chapel. No one saw them. No one checked on them. This was simply the reality of mountain life in that era. You laid in supplies, you endured, and you emerged in the spring. But what happened in that house during those isolated months is something that can only be pieced together from fragments, from Margaret's later testimony, from the physical evidence found in the house, and from the contents of Reverend Holloway's journal, which revealed a mind that had traveled to very dark places indeed. When spring came in 1843 and the trail finally cleared enough for travel, the Holloways did not emerge. Sarah Hendricks made the journey to the parish house in late April, concerned because she hadn't seen them at all, and worried that illness or accident might have befallen them. She found the house locked tight, curtains drawn across every window. She knocked repeatedly on the door, calling out, receiving no answer. She walked around to the chapel entrance and found that locked as well. Growing genuinely worried now, she tried to peer through gaps in the curtains, but could see nothing in the darkened interior. She was about to leave and fetch help from town when the front door suddenly opened. Reverend Holloway stood in the doorway, and Sarah would later testify that she almost didn't recognize him. He had lost a significant amount of weight, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. His hair, always neat before, was unkempt and streaked with more grey than she remembered. But it was his eyes that truly disturbed her. They had a fevered quality, bright and intense in his gaunt face, and they looked through her rather than at her. When Sarah asked if everything was all right, if they needed anything, Reverend Holloway had smiled in a way that made her take an involuntary step backward. "Everything is as it should be, Sister Sarah," he'd said, using a form of address he'd never used before. "We are blessed. We are chosen. The covenant has been made and sealed." When she asked about Margaret, asked if she could see the girl, the Reverend's smile had widened. "Margaret is no longer a girl. She has assumed her sacred role. She has become what she was always meant to be." He wouldn't elaborate further, wouldn't let Sarah into the house, wouldn't allow her to see Margaret. He accepted the supplies she'd brought, thanked her with that same unsettling smile, and closed the door firmly, the lock clicking into place with a sound that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Sarah Hendricks went directly to town and spoke to Sheriff William Morrison, telling him that something was very wrong at the Holloway parish. But what could she report exactly? That the Reverend seemed strange, that he wouldn't let her see his daughter. These weren't crimes. The sheriff promised to ride out to the parish when he had time, but spring was a busy season, and there were more pressing matters. Weeks passed. Sarah tried to put her concerns aside, telling herself she was being foolish, that the isolation of winter had simply made the Holloways peculiar, that they would return to normal once they'd had more contact with other people. But she couldn't shake the image of Reverend Holloway's fevered eyes, or the way he'd said Margaret is no longer a girl. It was in June of 1843 that the Holloways began appearing at Sunday services again, and what the parishioners saw confirmed Sarah Hendricks's worst fears while simultaneously providing no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Margaret Holloway, now 11 years old, sat in the front pew dressed entirely in black, wearing what appeared to be mourning clothes, though no death had been announced. Her hair was pulled back so severely that it seemed to pull at the skin of her face, giving her features a stretched, unnatural quality. She wore a simple gold band on the ring finger of her left hand. This detail was noticed by several people but understood by none of them. Not yet. She sat with perfect posture throughout the service, her hands folded over a small black Bible, her eyes fixed on her father as he preached. She never looked at the other congregants. She never smiled. She barely seemed to blink. Reverend Holloway's sermon that first Sunday back was about the story of Jephthah, from the book of Judges, the man who made a vow to God and was forced to sacrifice his daughter to fulfill it. The Reverend's voice rose and fell with passionate intensity as he spoke about the necessity of keeping vows no matter the personal cost, about how God sometimes demanded terrible things from those he loved most, about how true faith meant absolute surrender, even when you couldn't understand the purpose. Jephthah's daughter went willingly, the Reverend proclaimed, his eyes blazing from the pulpit, because she understood that some souls are meant for sacrifice, that some lives are meant to be given over completely to fulfill a divine purpose. She did not question. She did not resist. She accepted her role. As he said this, his gaze fell on Margaret in the front pew, and several people later recalled the way she straightened her spine under his look, as if responding to an unspoken command. After the service, several women approached Margaret, trying to be kind, trying to draw her into conversation. Martha Green, who had a daughter near Margaret's age, asked if Margaret might like to come visit, perhaps spend an afternoon playing with the other children. Margaret had looked at Martha with those disturbingly adult eyes and said, "I don't play anymore, Mrs. Green. I have duties now. I am a wife." The word hung in the air like something obscene. Martha had laughed nervously, assuming it was some strange game or childish fantasy, and said something about all little girls pretending to be grown up. But Margaret hadn't laughed. She'd simply turned away and walked to where her father stood speaking with some of the men, positioning herself slightly behind him and to his left, in the exact stance a wife might take. Martha felt her stomach turn over. She caught Sarah Hendricks's eye across the chapel yard, and in that shared glance, both women acknowledged that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The following week, Martha Green's husband Robert went to Sheriff Morrison with a group of other men from the congregation. They expressed their concerns about young Margaret Holloway, about her strange behavior and stranger words. The sheriff agreed to visit the parish and speak with Reverend Holloway. He made the journey on a Tuesday afternoon, arriving at the parish house to find both the Reverend and Margaret working in the small garden behind the house. The sheriff later testified that the scene appeared perfectly normal at first glance. Father and daughter working together in the sunshine, pulling weeds and tending to vegetables. But as he watched them before announcing his presence, he noticed that they worked in complete silence, not exchanging a single word, and that Margaret moved from task to task with mechanical precision, as if following a choreographed routine rather than simply helping with chores. When Sheriff Morrison called out a greeting, Reverend Holloway straightened and smiled, welcoming him warmly. They spoke about inconsequential things at first, the weather and the garden, and the difficult winter path. The sheriff then carefully broached the subject of Margaret, mentioning that some folks in town were concerned about her, that she seemed different, that perhaps she might benefit from spending time with other children. The Reverend's expression had changed instantly, the warmth draining from his face to be replaced by something cold and hard. "My daughter is perfectly well, Sheriff. Better than well. She has found her purpose and her place. What the people of this town think about how I raise my child is none of their concern or yours." The sheriff tried to press further, tried to ask Margaret directly how she was faring, but the Reverend stepped between them, physically blocking his view of the girl. "I believe we're done here, Sheriff Morrison. Unless you have legal cause to be on my property, I'll ask you to leave." Sheriff Morrison had no legal cause. A father had every right to raise his daughter as he saw fit, as long as there was no evidence of physical harm. And there wasn't, not visible harm anyway. Margaret appeared healthy enough, adequately fed and clothed. The sheriff left the parish frustrated, but powerless. He reported back to the concerned families that he'd found nothing actionable, though he admitted to Robert Green privately that something about the situation made his skin crawl. "That little girl," he said, "she's not right. She's like a puppet, all wooden movements and glass eye. And that ring she wears, I asked about it, and the Reverend near about threw me off his land. Whatever's happening in that house, it ain't natural, but I'll be damned if I know what law he's breaking." Through the summer and into the fall of 1843, the Holloways continued to attend Sunday services, and Margaret's transformation continued to disturb everyone who saw her. She began wearing more elaborate clothing, dresses that were too adult for her small frame, with high collars and long sleeves, even in the heat. She wore the gold ring constantly. She walked with measured steps, as if counting each movement. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice had a rehearsed quality, as if she were reciting lines from a play. One Sunday in August, young Timothy Fletcher, who was 10 years old and simple-minded in the way that made him speak without filter, had run up to Margaret and asked her directly why she was so strange now. Margaret had looked down at him and said, in that flat, effectless voice, "I'm not strange, Timothy. I've been chosen. I've been made pure through marriage and sacrifice. My father says I'm special." Timothy had run crying to his mother, frightened by something in Margaret's eyes that he couldn't articulate, but felt in his bones. It was also during this period that Reverend Holloway began conducting what he called special services on Wednesday evenings. He announced these from the pulpit, saying that anyone who wished to deepen their faith and understanding was welcome to attend. The first Wednesday, 6 people showed up out of curiosity. They found the chapel lit only by candles, casting long shadows across the walls. Reverend Holloway preached about sacred mysteries, about hidden knowledge that could only be revealed to the truly faithful, about marriages made in heaven before they were made on earth. He spoke in a fevered, almost ecstatic manner, and Margaret sat in the front pew throughout, that gold ring catching the candlelight. The sermon made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite define. The biblical references seemed twisted somehow, taken out of context, and bent to support ideas that felt wrong, even if you couldn't explain why. After that first Wednesday service, only 2 people returned for the second one. By the third week, no one came except the Reverend and his daughter, and they conducted their Wednesday rituals alone. Sarah Hendricks made one more attempt to reach Margaret that fall. She went to the parish on a Thursday afternoon when she knew the Reverend would be visiting a sick parishioner several miles away. She found Margaret alone in the house, or so she thought. She knocked and called out, and eventually Margaret opened the door, looking neither surprised nor pleased to see her. Sarah had brought a basket of cookies and a small embroidered handkerchief as gifts. Peace offerings, excuses to spend time with the girl. Margaret accepted the gifts with mechanical politeness and invited Sarah inside, which was progress of a sort, though the house itself immediately set Sarah's nerves on edge. It was too dark, even in afternoon light, the windows covered with heavy curtains. It smelled of candle wax and something else, something vaguely chemical that Sarah couldn't identify. The furniture was arranged strangely, pushed back against the walls, as if to create empty space in the center of room. Sarah tried to make conversation, asking Margaret about her studies, about whether she had any friends, about what she did with her days. Margaret answered each question in brief, emotionless sentences. Yes, she studied. Her father taught her reading and scripture. No, she didn't need friends. Her days were filled with duties. When Sarah asked what kind of duties, Margaret had looked at her with those unsettling eyes and said, "Wife duties, Sister Sarah. I keep the house. I prepare the meals. I fulfill my covenant." Sarah felt ice run down her spine at the word covenant, the same word Reverend Holloway had used months earlier. She asked, trying to keep her voice gentle and non-threatening, what Margaret meant by covenant. Margaret had tilted her head as if considering whether to answer, and then said, "Father says some things are sacred mysteries, not for everyone to understand, but I can tell you this. I was married last winter, properly married, with vows and ceremony and everything recorded. Father performed the service himself. It's all legal and binding." Sarah Hendricks felt the room tilt around her. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, who Margaret had married. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been fear or might have been something else entirely. "Father says I'm not to speak his name to outsiders, but he's real, Sister Sarah. He's very real. I see him every night. He comes to me when the house is dark, and he claims what's his by right of marriage." The way Margaret said this in that same flat, rehearsed voice made it somehow worse than if she'd been crying or showing distress. Sarah tried to ask more questions, tried to understand what the girl was telling her, but at that moment they both heard the sound of a horse approaching. Margaret's entire body went rigid. "Father's home early," she whispered, and for the first time, real emotion showed in her face. Stark, primal terror. "You have to leave. Now. He can't know you were asking questions. Please, Sister Sarah, go. Go now." Sarah Hendricks fled, barely making it out the back door and into the woods before Reverend Holloway appeared in the front yard. She hid behind a large oak tree, watching through the autumn foliage as the Reverend dismounted his horse and entered the house. She heard raised voices, though she couldn't make out words. She heard a sharp crack that might have been a hand striking flesh. She heard Margaret cry out once, a sound of pain that was quickly cut off. Then silence. Sarah waited in the woods for nearly an hour, shaking with cold and fear, before finally making her way home by a roundabout path. That night she told her husband everything, and together they decided to go to Sheriff Morrison first thing in the morning with Margaret's own words as evidence that something criminal was happening at the Holloway parish. But morning brought a development that changed everything. At dawn, a rider arrived in town with news that spread quickly through the community. Reverend Thomas Holloway had appeared at the county seat, 20 miles away the previous evening, and filed formal marriage documents. The documents listed him as the officiant and contained all the proper legal language and seals. The bride was listed as Margaret Catherine Holloway, age listed as 18 years. The groom was listed as Samuel Thorne, age 26, occupation listed as missionary. The marriage was dated February 14th, 1843, but had only now been officially registered. The documents were technically legal, bearing the Reverend's seal and signature as an ordained minister authorized to perform marriages. The county clerk had accepted them without question, having no reason to doubt a man of the cloth. When Sheriff Morrison saw these documents, when he saw Margaret's age falsified and the groom's name revealed, he immediately began investigating. Who was Samuel Thorne? Where was? Why hadn't anyone in the parish ever seen this supposed missionary? The sheriff sent inquiries to every church and missionary organization in the region. No Samuel Thorne existed in any records. No missionary by that name had ever been registered or ordained. The man was a ghost, a fiction, but the marriage certificate was real, filed in official records, bearing legal seals and signatures. It created a paradox that the sheriff couldn't immediately resolve. If the groom didn't exist, then the marriage was fraudulent. But if the marriage was fraudulent, why had Reverend Holloway filed it at all? What purpose did it serve? The answer began to emerge when the sheriff, now deeply suspicious, obtained a warrant to search the parish house and interview Margaret Holloway formally. He assembled a group of 6 men, including a doctor and a lawyer, and rode out to the parish on a cold morning in November. What they found there, what they discovered in that dark house, would haunt every man present for the rest of their lives and would eventually lead to the sealing of the case records for over a century. The men arrived at the parish house just after dawn, the sun barely cresting the mountains and casting long shadows across the property. Sheriff Morrison knocked firmly on the door, warrant in hand, prepared for resistance, but the door opened almost immediately, as if Reverend Holloway had been waiting for them. He stood in the doorway wearing a black robe, his hair wild around his face, and that same fevered brightness burning in his eyes. He looked at the sheriff and the assembled men and smiled. A terrible smile full of certainty and something that might have been relief. "You've come," he said simply. "I knew you would eventually. The unenlightened always fear what they cannot understand." He stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. "Come in then, see what you came to see. Bear witness to the sacred work." The interior of the house struck every man as profoundly wrong the moment they crossed the threshold. The curtains were all drawn, plunging the rooms into a gloom barely relieved by candles burning in every corner. The furniture had been rearranged into geometric patterns that served no practical purpose. Chairs and tables positioned at precise angles, as if forming some kind of diagram. The walls were covered with papers, hundreds of them filled with writing in Reverend Holloway's distinctive hand. Biblical verses were mixed with strange symbols and diagrams that looked like architectural drawings or perhaps maps of something that existed only in the Reverend's mind. The chemical smell Sarah Hendricks had noticed was stronger now, emanating from somewhere deeper in the house. Dr. Harrison, who had come along to examine Margaret if needed, walked to one of the walls and began reading the papers posted there. His face went progressively paler as he scanned the text. The writings detailed a theology that had diverged drastically from any recognized Christian doctrine. Reverend Holloway had developed an elaborate theory about sacred marriages, about how certain souls were designated before birth to be joined in unions that transcended normal human understanding. He wrote about purification through isolation, about how a child bride could be made holy through specific ekshaks and ceremonies. He referenced obscure Gnostic texts and apocryphal scriptures, twisting them to support his narrative. Most disturbingly, he wrote extensively about something he called the preparation, a months-long process by which Margaret had been made ready for her role as a vessel of divine purpose. Sheriff Morrison demanded to see Margaret immediately. Reverend Holloway's smile never wavered. "Of course, Sheriff. My wife is upstairs in our chamber. She's expecting you." The casual way he said "my wife" made several of the men gasp audibly. The Reverend led them up the narrow staircase to the second floor, moving with an unsettling grace, almost gliding across the wooden boards. He stopped at a closed door at the end of the hallway and knocked 3 times in a precise rhythm. "Margaret, my dear, we have visitors. The authorities have come to question the legitimacy of our union. Will you tell them what they need to know?" A small voice answered from within, barely audible. "Yes, husband, I will tell them." The word husband coming from that child's voice made Sheriff Morrison's hand instinctively move to his weapon, though he didn't draw it. Reverend Holloway opened the door and stepped aside, allowing the men to see into the room. What they saw would be described in official reports, with clinical detachment, but the emotional impact on the witnesses was evident in their later testimonies, in the way their hands shook when holding the depositions, in the way several of them could never speak of it without visible distress. Margaret sat in the center of the room on a simple wooden chair, positioned exactly in the middle, as if measured. She wore a white dress that resembled a wedding gown, though it was sized for a child and looked grotesque rather than innocent. The gold ring on her finger caught the candlelight. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, which was the first time anyone had seen it unbound in months. She looked even younger than her 11 years in that moment, small and fragile and terribly, terribly wrong in that setting. The room itself was arranged like a bridal chamber in some twisted mockery of normalcy. There was a large bed with white linens. There was a dressing table with a mirror. There were flowers in a vase, though they were dead and dried, their petals fallen and scattered across the floor like drops of blood. Dr. Harrison moved forward slowly, speaking in the gentlest voice he could manage. "Margaret, dear child, are you hurt? Have you been harmed?" Margaret looked at him with those dark, ancient eyes and shook her head. "No, Dr. Harrison. I have not been harmed. I have been consecrated. There's a difference." The doctor knelt before her, positioning himself at her eye level. "Margaret, I need you to tell me the truth. Do you understand what marriage means? Do you understand what your father has done?" Margaret's expression didn't change. "Father has married me to Samuel Thorne in accordance with divine mandate. The ceremony was performed on February 14th of this year. I spoke my vows willingly. I wear his ring. I am his wife in the eyes of God and the law." Sheriff Morrison, struggling to maintain his composure, asked the obvious question. "Margaret, where is Samuel Thorne? Where is this man you claim to have married?" For the first time, something shifted in Margaret's expression. A small smile touched her lips, but it was nothing like a child's smile. It was knowing and cold and utterly of innocence. "Samuel is always here, Sheriff. He never leaves. He comes to me every night and claims his marital rights. He whispers things to me in the darkness. He tells me I'm special, chosen, purified. Father says Samuel exists in a higher state, that not everyone can see him because they lack the spiritual sight, but I see him clearly. I feel him clearly." She raised her left hand, displaying the ring. "This is his proof. This is his claim on me." The lawyer in the group, Jonathan Edwards, a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, asked the question they were all thinking. "Child, are you saying your husband is a spirit? A ghost? Are you claiming you married something that isn't human?" Margaret tilted her head, considering. "I'm saying that Samuel Thorne is real in the ways that matter. He exists. He touches me. He speaks to me. Whether you can see him or not doesn't change his reality." Father prepared me to perceive what others cannot. That was part of the purification. Reverend Holloway, still standing in the doorway, spoke up then, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "Gentlemen, you stand in the presence of a miracle. My daughter is no ordinary child. She was chosen before her birth to serve a higher purpose." Her mother understood this, though it broke her heart. Catherine knew what Margaret was meant to become. The consumption that took her was no natural illness. It was the weight of knowing, the burden of understanding what had to be done. After Catherine passed, I received my instructions clearly. Margaret was to be prepared, purified, made ready for a sacred union that would transcend the physical realm. He stepped into the room, moving to stand behind Margaret's chair, placing his hands on her shoulders in a possessive gesture that made several of the men move forward instinctively. "I spent months preparing her," the Reverend continued, "teaching her, training her, breaking down the barriers that separate the physical from the spiritual. The preparation required isolation, discipline, constant ritual. I taught her to see beyond the veil, to perceive the presence that had been designated as her husband. And on February 14th, when she had been properly prepared, I performed the ceremony. I officiated at my daughter's wedding to Samuel Thorne, a being of higher purpose who exists in the spaces between worlds." Dr. Harrison stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Reverend Holloway, what you're describing is not a miracle. It's madness at best, and criminal abuse at worst. You've isolated and manipulated a child, filled her head with delusions, and created an elaborate fiction to justify God knows what depravity. This Samuel Thorne doesn't exist. He's a fantasy you've constructed." "He exists," Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through the doctor's words with surprising force. "He exists because Father made him exist. Through the rituals, through the preparation, through the months of teaching me to see. Father opened a door, and Samuel came through it. He's real because we made him real. Don't you understand? That's what the purification was for. Father didn't just prepare me to see Samuel. Father created Samuel by preparing me." The room fell silent. The implications of what Margaret had just said settled over the assembled men like a physical weight. Sheriff Morrison, his voice shaking slightly, asked Margaret, "What exactly did your father do during this preparation? What did the rituals involve?" Margaret's expression remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes, some memory or emotion that she quickly suppressed. "Father would take me to the chapel late at night, after midnight when the world was quietest. He would light candles in specific patterns and make me stand in the center. He would pray over me for hours, sometimes until dawn. He would recite verses and incantations, mixing scripture with other words I didn't understand. He would touch my forehead with oil and trace symbols on my skin. He would make me fast for days at a time, saying hunger opened the spiritual senses. He would keep me awake for days, saying exhaustion thinned the veil. And slowly over months, I began to see things, shadows that moved wrong, shapes in the corners that vanished when I looked directly at them. And finally I saw him, Samuel, standing in the chapel, wearing a dark suit, smiling at me. Father said it was proof the preparation had worked, that I was ready." One of the other men in the group, a farmer named Jacob Miller, who had come along as a witness, spoke up then, his voice rough with emotion. "Reverend, where is your son? Where is Daniel? He disappeared around the same time you started this madness. What happened to that boy?" The Reverend's hands tightened on Margaret's shoulders, his fingers digging into the fabric of her white dress. "Daniel couldn't understand. He tried to interfere. He said I was hurting Margaret, that I had to stop. He threatened to go to the authorities, to expose the sacred work before it was complete. I couldn't allow that. The preparation couldn't be interrupted, so I ensured Daniel wouldn't interfere." The men exchanged glances, a horrible understanding dawning. Sheriff Morrison's hand went to his weapon again, this time with purpose. "Thomas Holloway, What did you do to your son?" The Reverend's fevered eyes met the sheriff's, and in them was no remorse, only that terrible certainty. "What needed to be done? The boy is in the cellar. He's been there since October of 1841. He became part of the foundation, quite literally. His blood consecrated the space where the true work began." Margaret needed to understand the seriousness of the covenant, the finality of it. Sacrifice was required. Daniel provided that sacrifice. The room erupted into chaos. Two of the men grabbed Reverend Holloway, pulling him away from Margaret. Dr. Harrison swept the girl up in his arms, carrying her away from her father despite her strange protests that she needed to stay, that Samuel wouldn't like her leaving, that the covenant demanded her presence in the house. Sheriff Morrison and Jacob Miller ran downstairs to the cellar, lighting lanterns and descending into the darkness beneath the house. What they found there confirmed the worst of their fears and added layers of horror they hadn't anticipated. The cellar had been converted into something between a shrine and a tomb. The walls were covered with more of the Reverend's writings, the text growing increasingly unhinged and illegible. The deeper into the space they went, candles had been arranged in complex patterns, many burned down to stubs, and in the corner, partially concealed behind a cloth curtain, were human remains. Daniel Holloway's body, or what was left of it, had been positioned in a sitting posture against the wall, skeletal hands arranged in an attitude of prayer. The skull was crushed on one side, suggesting a violent death, and around the body, carved into the dirt floor, were symbols and words in multiple languages, creating a circle that enclosed the remains. But this wasn't the worst discovery in the cellar. Against the opposite wall they found a collection of journals, dozens of them, all in Reverend Holloway's handwriting. Sheriff Morrison grabbed one at random and began reading by lantern light. The entries detailed a descent into obsession and madness that had apparently begun years before the family even moved to the isolated parish. Reverend Holloway had become convinced that he had been chosen to facilitate a union between the human and spirit worlds, that his daughter was a designated vessel for this purpose, and that her preparation would require methods that he knew were both illegal and deeply wrong, but which he believed were divinely mandated. The journals revealed that Catherine, Margaret's mother, had not died of pneumonia at all. She had killed herself, unable to bear what her husband was planning for their daughter, though the Reverend had recorded her death as natural illness to avoid questions. The journals also detailed the creation of Samuel Thorne, and this was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. Samuel Thorne was not, as they had assumed, simply a fictional name, used to create false legal documents. According to the Reverend's writings, Samuel Thorne had been a real person, a missionary who had died in the region in 1839. Buried in an unmarked grave after succumbing to fever while traveling through the mountains. Reverend Holloway had learned of this death, had found the grave, and had become convinced that the deceased missionary's spirit could be called back and bound to Margaret through ritual and ceremony. The journals described necromantic practices, invocations and offerings performed at the gravesite, attempts to create a spirit husband for his daughter by binding the dead man's essence to her through repeated ceremonies. Whether Reverend Holloway had actually succeeded in calling forth something, or whether he had simply driven both himself and his daughter into shared delusion through isolation, trauma, and psychological manipulation, would remain a matter of debate among those who studied the case. But the physical evidence was undeniable. Margaret had been subjected to years of abuse disguised as spiritual preparation. She had been isolated, starved, sleep-deprived, and subjected to hours-long rituals designed to break down her perception of reality. Her father had killed her brother to prevent interference, and had concealed the murder. He had created elaborate legal documents to give his abuse a veneer of legitimacy, and he had convinced his daughter, through sustained psychological torture, that she was married to a dead man's spirit. Sheriff Morrison and Jacob Miller brought the journals upstairs, their faces ashen. They found Reverend Holloway restrained in the parlor, still smiling that terrible smile, still insisting that what he had done was holy work, that they were interrupting something sacred and would suffer divine consequence for their interference. Margaret had been wrapped in a blanket by Dr. Harrison and was sitting on the front porch, away from her father, though she kept looking back at the house with an expression of longing and fear mixed together in ways that broke the heart to see. The sheriff made the decision then to arrest Reverend Thomas Holloway on charges of murder and child abuse. The Reverend was taken into custody without resistance, still smiling, still proclaiming that the covenant could not be broken, that Margaret would always belong to Samuel Thorne regardless of what the temporal authorities did. Margaret was placed in the care of Sarah Hendricks temporarily, though the girl seemed barely aware of her surroundings, moving like a sleepwalker, repeatedly touching the gold ring on her finger as if to reassure herself it was still there. The house was searched thoroughly over the following days. More journals were found, documenting every step of the Reverend's descent into madness. The marriage certificate was seized as evidence, along with all the ritual implements found in the chapel and cellar. Daniel's remains were recovered and given a proper burial. The house itself would eventually be burned on the order of the county, deemed too tainted to be salvaged or sold. But before it burned, one more discovery was made that added a final layer of horror to an already nightmarish case. In Margaret's room, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under where her chair had been positioned, they found a box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in a different hand than Reverend Holloway's script. The letters were addressed to Margaret and signed by Samuel Thorne. They were love letters of sorts, though they contained elements that were deeply disturbing, possessive declarations of ownership, mixed with promises of eternal union. The handwriting was accomplished and educated, nothing like what one would expect from a spirit or delusion. The paper showed signs of age, some letters clearly older than others, and most impossibly, the most recent letter was dated just 3 days before the authorities had arrived, suggesting that someone or something had been adding to the collection even as the investigation approached. Handwriting analysis would later determine that the letters were not written by Reverend Holloway, despite the obvious conclusion that he must have created them as part of Margaret's psychological manipulation. The hand was distinctly different, the style and vocabulary more sophisticated. Some experts suggested the Reverend had deliberately changed his handwriting and elevated his language to create a convincing fiction. Others, including a noted investigator who examined the case, suggested something more disturbing, that the Reverend had found actual letters written by the real Samuel Thorne before his death and had somehow used them, perhaps even continuing them through some form of automatic writing, while in a dissociative state. But there was a third possibility that no one wanted to seriously consider, though it lingered unspoken in the minds of everyone who had been in that house. The letters felt wrong in ways that transcended rational explanation. They carried a presence, an atmosphere that made people uncomfortable to handle them. Several men who examined them reported feeling watched while reading them, or experiencing vivid nightmares afterward. The letters were eventually sealed with the other evidence, locked away in a vault where they would remain for over a century, and everyone involved tried very hard not to think about what they implied. The trial of Reverend Thomas Holloway began in January of 1844, and became a spectacle that drew attention from across the region. People traveled for days to attend the proceedings, crowding into the small courthouse to hear testimony about the horrors that had unfolded in the isolated parish. The prosecution laid out a case that seemed straightforward on the surface. A man had murdered his son, abused his daughter through sustained psychological and possibly physical torture, and created an elaborate fiction to justify his crimes. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that nothing about the Holloway case was straightforward, and the proceedings would raise questions that transcended the legal framework designed to contain them. Reverend Holloway defended himself, refusing the services of any attorney. He stood before the court in his black robe, gaunt and wild-eyed, and delivered speeches that were part legal defense, part sermon, and part manifesto of a theology that had diverged so far from Christianity that it became something else entirely. He did not deny killing his son. He described it in meticulous detail, explaining how Daniel had discovered him conducting a midnight ritual with Margaret in the chapel, how the boy had attacked him physically trying to protect his sister, and how in the struggle the Reverend had struck Daniel's head against the stone altar, fracturing his skull. He described dragging the body to the cellar, positioning it in prayer, and spending the next 3 days consecrating the space with Daniel's blood, believing that his son's death had been divinely ordained to provide the necessary sacrifice for Margaret's transformation. He did not deny subjecting Margaret to the rituals, the starvation, the sleep deprivation, the hours of prayer and incantation. He described these practices as necessary purification, comparing them to the trials endured by mystics and saints throughout history. He read passages from obscure religious texts, from Gnostic Gospels and apocryphal writings, attempting to justify his actions through theological argument. He insisted repeatedly that Margaret had consented to everything, that she had understood and accepted her role as a sacred vessel, that the marriage to Samuel Thorne was legitimate in the eyes of God if not in the eyes of men. When the judge tried to interrupt these speeches, tried to redirect him to the actual charges, the Reverend would simply continue speaking, his voice rising in volume and intensity, until he was forcibly silenced. The most anticipated and dreaded testimony was Margaret's. At 11 years old, she was considered old enough to testify, though the judge ordered the courtroom cleared of all spectators except essential personnel when she took the stand. What Margaret said in that closed session was transcribed by the court recorder, and the transcript itself became part of the sealed record that would not be opened for over a century. But those who were present in the room that day carried the weight of her words for the rest of their lives, and fragments of her testimony leaked out over the years, spreading through the community in whispers and half-remembered accounts. Margaret testified in that same flat, affectless voice that had become her normal mode of speech. She confirmed the basic facts that the prosecution had established. Yes, her father had killed Daniel. She had watched it happen. Yes, she had been subjected to the rituals and preparations. Yes, her father had performed a marriage ceremony in which she had spoken vows to Samuel Thorne. But when asked if she had been forced into these things, if she had been coerced or threatened, her answer complicated the narrative in ways that disturbed everyone present. She said that she had not been forced, not exactly. She said that her father had explained what was necessary, what her role required, and she had accepted it because the alternative was worse. When asked what alternative she meant, she had looked directly at the judge and said, "The alternative was being left alone with Samuel without preparation. Father said Samuel had already chosen me, that he was coming for me whether I was ready or not. The rituals made me ready. The preparation gave me defenses. Without it, Samuel would have destroyed me." This testimony raised the question that would haunt the case forever. Had Margaret actually experienced something supernatural, or had her father's sustained abuse created a delusional framework so powerful that she genuinely believed in the reality of her spirit husband? The judge, a pragmatic man named Silas Crawford, tried to approach this clinically. He asked Margaret to describe Samuel Thorne, to explain what she meant when she said he came to her at night. Margaret's description was disturbingly detailed. She described a man of about 26 years, tall and thin, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She said he wore clothes from an earlier era, a dark suit with a high collar, and that he smelled of earth and something sweet that she couldn't identify. She said he spoke to her in a voice that seemed to come from inside her own head rather than from outside. She said he touched her with hands that were cold and left no marks but could be felt for hours afterward. When asked what Samuel wanted from her, what he did during these nightly visits, Margaret's composure finally cracked slightly. Her voice remained flat, but tears began to run down her face as she spoke. She said that Samuel claimed her, that he reinforced the bond created by the marriage ceremony, that he told her she belonged to him in ways that transcended life and death. She said he was jealous and possessive, that he became angry if she thought of leaving or of breaking the covenant. She said he promised that they would be together forever, that even death would not separate them, that he would follow her through all the years of her life and into whatever came after. When the judge asked if Samuel had harmed her physically, Margaret had hesitated for a long time before answering. Finally, she said, "Samuel can't harm me the way living men can, but he can hurt me in other ways. He can make me feel things. He can fill my head with thoughts that aren't mine. He can make me remember things that never happened or forget things that did." Father said the preparation would protect me from this, would make me strong enough to endure Samuel's attentions, but I don't know if it worked. I don't know anymore what's real and what Samuel makes me think is real. This testimony created an impossible situation for the court. If Margaret was delusional, a victim of her father's abuse who had internalized his false narrative to the point of vivid hallucination, then Reverend Holloway was clearly guilty of driving his daughter to madness through sustained torture. But if Margaret was not delusional, if something had actually attached itself to her through her father's rituals, then the case entered territory that the legal system had no framework to address. Judge Crawford ultimately decided to treat the matter as the former, as a case of induced delusion and psychological abuse. But his private journals, discovered after his death in 1869, revealed his uncertainty. He wrote that Margaret's testimony had an eerie credibility, that her descriptions were too consistent and detailed to be simple fantasy, and that he had felt something in the courtroom during her testimony, a presence that made the hair on his neck stand up and his skin go cold. The verdict was delivered in March of 18. Reverend Thomas Holloway was found guilty of murder in the death of his son Daniel, and guilty of child abuse in his treatment of Margaret. He was sentenced to hang, with the execution scheduled for April 5. The Reverend received the verdict with that same unshakable smile, declaring that earthly justice was meaningless, that his work was complete, and that the covenant he had forged could not be broken by any court or any law. He was removed from the courtroom, still proclaiming Margaret's eternal bond to Samuel Thorne, still insisting that what he had done was sacred duty. Margaret was placed in the care of a family in town, the Mitchells, who had no children of their own and were considered respectable and kind. The hope was that in a normal home environment, surrounded by compassionate people, Margaret would gradually recover from her ordeal and return to something resembling a normal childhood. But Margaret did not recover. She remained withdrawn and strange, speaking only when directly addressed, moving through the Mitchell house like a ghost. She refused to remove the gold ring from her finger, becoming violently agitated when anyone suggested taking it off. She slept poorly, often waking the household with screams in the night. She would be found standing at windows in the dark hours before dawn, staring out at nothing, or at something only she could see, whispering to the empty air in a language no one recognized. Mrs. Mitchell, a patient woman who genuinely wanted to help, tried various approaches to reach the girl. She brought in a minister from a different denomination to pray with Margaret, hoping that positive religious instruction might counteract the twisted theology her father had imposed. But Margaret reacted to the minister's presence with stark terror, backing into a corner and crying out that Samuel was angry, that he didn't want other religious men near her, that the covenant forbade it. The minister left shaken, later telling Miss Mitchell that he had felt an oppressive atmosphere around the girl, a heaviness that made him struggle to breathe, and that he had seen shadows move in ways that defied natural light. Miss Mitchell tried removing all religious items from Margaret's room, thinking perhaps the associations were too traumatic. But this made things worse. Margaret became convinced that without the proper protections, without the prayers and symbols her father had taught her, Samuel would be able to harm her more severely. She began scratching symbols into the walls of her room with her fingernails, reproducing from memory the patterns that had covered the parish house. When the Mitchells stopped her from doing this, she scratched the symbols into her own skin instead, leaving angry red marks on her arms and legs that looked disturbingly like the diagrams from her father's journals. Dr. Harrison, who had examined Margaret the day of her rescue, continued to monitor her condition. He documented everything meticulously, creating a case study that he hoped might help understand and treat what he termed induced religious mania, with dissociative features. But as the weeks passed and Margaret's condition did not improve, even Dr. Harrison began to question his rational framework. He observed things that troubled him, details that suggested something beyond psychological trauma. Margaret knew things she shouldn't have known, specific details about Samuel Thorne's life that had not been in her father's journals or anywhere she could have learned them. When Dr. Harrison researched the historical Samuel Thorne out of curiosity, tracking down records from 1839, he discovered that Margaret's descriptions matched the real man with uncanny accuracy, including details about his appearance and manner that had never been publicly recorded. On the night before Reverend Holloway's execution, Margaret woke screaming at the exact same time her father was conducting what would be his final ritual in his cell. The jailer reported that the Reverend had spent the hours before dawn in prayer, speaking in that strange combination of languages, performing movements that looked like the gestures of ceremony, despite the chains that bound him. And at the moment Margaret woke screaming in the Mitchell house 5 miles away, the Reverend had called out her name 3 times, declaring that the bond was complete, that Samuel would hold her until death and beyond, that the covenant was sealed in perpetuity. The coincidence of timing was noted by everyone involved and troubled them deeply. The execution proceeded as scheduled on April 15, 1844. A crowd gathered to witness the hanging, the largest assembly the town had seen. Reverend Thomas Holloway walked to the gallows calmly, still smiling, still proclaiming the righteousness of his actions. His final words before the hood was placed over his head were not prayers for forgiveness or declarations of repentance. Instead, he looked out at the crowd and said, "My daughter is bound to Samuel Thorne in covenant eternal. What has been joined through sacred ritual cannot be sundered by mortal interference. Margaret will carry this bond until her last breath, and perhaps beyond. I have done what was required of me. The rest is between her and her husband." The hood was placed, the trap was sprung, and Reverend Thomas Holloway died by hanging at approximately 10 in the morning. At the exact moment of his death, reported by multiple witnesses, Margaret Holloway collapsed in the Mitchell house. She fell to the floor as if struck, her body going rigid, her hairs rolling back in her head. Mrs. Mitchell and the doctor, who happened to be present, rushed to her side. Margaret convulsed for several minutes, foam appearing at her mouth, her hands clawing at the air as if fighting something invisible. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the episode ended. Margaret went limp, unconscious, but breathing. When she woke several hours later, something fundamental had changed. The flat, affectless quality of her speech was gone, replaced by something that seemed almost like relief, though tinged with exhaustion and lingering fear. The first words she spoke were, "Father is gone. I felt him leave. The door he opened is still there, but he's not holding it anymore. Does that mean Samuel might leave too?" But Samuel did not leave. Over the following weeks, as Margaret slowly began to emerge from the worst of her trauma, as she started to speak more freely about her experiences, it became clear that while her father's death had changed something, it had not freed her from whatever presence she had become bound to. She still felt Samuel's attention, still experienced his nightly visits, though she said they were different now, less controlled, more chaotic. She said that her father had maintained certain boundaries through his rituals, had kept Samuel somewhat contained, but with the Reverend dead, those boundaries were dissolving. Samuel was becoming stronger, more present, more demanding. The ring on her finger began to feel tighter, she said, as if it were shrinking, binding itself to her flesh. Dr. Harrison, increasingly convinced that something beyond psychology was at work, consulted with experts in various fields. He brought in a professor of anthropology from a university in the East who had studied tribal shamanism and ritual practices. The professor examined the case records and interviewed Margaret extensively. His conclusion was disturbing, but offered a framework for understanding. Reverend Holloway had practiced a form of necromancy mixed with elements of various occult traditions, and whether he had succeeded in actually binding a spirit to his daughter, or had simply created a psychological construct powerful enough to manifest physical effects, the result was functionally the same. Margaret believed she was married to a dead man's spirit, and that belief was so deeply embedded, so reinforced by trauma and ritual, that it created a reality she could not escape. The professor suggested that the only way to free Margaret would be to perform a counter-ritual, something that would symbolically break the covenant her father had created. But this presented ethical and practical problems. A counter-ritual would require engaging with the same belief system that had damaged Margaret in the first place, potentially re-traumatizing her. It would require accepting, at least symbolically, that the marriage to Samuel Thorne was real and needed to be formally dissolved. And it would require finding someone knowledgeable enough in these dark practices to create an effective counter-ceremony, which meant potentially exposing Margaret to another person who dealt in dangerous spiritual territory. After much debate and consultation, it was decided to attempt a simpler approach first. The gold ring, which had become a focus for Margaret's belief in her binding to Samuel, would be removed. This would be done carefully, with Margaret's consent if possible, as a symbolic act of breaking the covenant. A jeweler was brought in to cut the ring from her finger, as it had indeed tightened over the months, and could no longer be simply pulled off. The procedure was scheduled for a morning in June, with Dr. Harrison and the Mitchells present to support Margaret through the process. But the night before the ring was to be removed, something happened that changed everything and cemented the Holloway case as one of the most disturbing and inexplicable events in the region's history. Margaret woke the household with screams more terrible than any they had heard before. When Mrs. Mitchell rushed to her room, they found her standing in the center of the floor, her nightgown torn, her hair wild around her face, and her left hand extended before her, staring at it in intense horror. The gold ring was gone. In its place, burned into her flesh, as if by a brand, was a mark in the exact shape of the ring, a perfect circle seared into her finger. The smell of burnt flesh filled the room. Margaret was sobbing, repeating over and over, "He took it back. He took it into me. Now I can never remove it. The covenant is in my skin, in my bones. He's marked me forever." Dr. Harrison was summoned immediately. He examined the burn, which defied medical explanation. The tissue was damaged in a way that suggested prolonged exposure to intense heat, yet there was no source for such heat in the locked room. The mark was too perfect, too precisely circular, to be accidental, and most impossibly, when examined closely, the burn seemed to have depth, as if the mark extended not just through the surface skin, but deeper, into the underlying tissue and possibly even into the bone itself. It was not simply a surface wound. It was a brand that went to the core of her finger. Margaret's testimony about what had happened that night would be the last entry in Dr. Harrison's case study, before he abandoned the project as beyond his capacity to treat or explain. She said she had woken to find Samuel standing over her bed, more solid and present than he had ever appeared before. She said he had taken her left hand in both of his cold ones and told her that the living world was trying to break what had been sealed, but that he would not permit it. She said he had pressed his thumbs against the ring, and she had felt heat, terrible burning heat, as the metal seemed to liquefy and sink into her flesh. She said the pain had been beyond anything she could describe, but she had been unable to move or cry out until it was finished. She said Samuel had smiled at her with those dark eyes and told her, "Now you are marked as mine in ways that cannot be undone." The ring was symbol. This mark is substance. You will carry me in your flesh until flesh fails, and then you will carry me beyond. After the night the ring burned into her flesh, Margaret Holloway changed in ways that went beyond the visible mark she now carried. The Mitchells, despite their genuine compassion and desire to help, found themselves unable to continue caring for the girl. The atmosphere in their home had become oppressive, heavy with a presence that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as time passed. Objects would be found moved from where they had been placed, always in Margaret's vicinity. Temperatures would drop suddenly in whatever room she occupied, cold spots that made breath visible even in the summer heat. And there were the sounds, whispers, that seemed to come from the walls themselves, always when Margaret was near. Always in a voice too low to make out words, but somehow conveying menace and possession. The Mitchells, good Christian people who had never believed in ghosts or spirits, found their rationality crumbling under the weight of experiences they could not explain away. In August of 1844, Margaret was transferred to the care of a religious community of women, a small convent-like establishment run by an order that specialized in caring for troubled girls. The sisters there were experienced with difficult cases, girls who had suffered trauma or abuse, and they approached Margaret with patience and determination. But even these experienced women found themselves unsettled by the child in their care. Margaret was cooperative and quiet, following all rules and routines without complaint, yet there was something fundamentally wrong about her presence. She seemed to carry shadows with her, darkness that clung to her like a second skin. The other girls in the facility were terrified of her, reporting that they could hear voices coming from Margaret's room at night. Two voices, one belonging to Margaret and one belonging to something else, engaged in conversations that sounded like arguments between a wife and a jealous husband. Sister Catherine, who supervised the facility, kept detailed records of Margaret's time there, records that would eventually be added to the sealed case file. She documented numerous incidents that defied natural explanation. Margaret's branded finger never healed properly, remaining angry and inflamed, despite treatment, occasionally weeping a clear fluid that left stains on bandages that looked disturbingly like the shape of letters or symbols. Margaret would sometimes speak in voices not her own, deeper voices, masculine voices, saying things that a 12-year-old girl could not possibly know about theology, history, or languages she had never studied. She would have episodes where she seemed to be in two places at once, her body present in the room, but her attention clearly focused on something or someone invisible to others, responding to questions no one else could hear, and reacting to touches that left no visible marks, but caused her obvious pain or distress. Sister Catherine, a woman of deep faith, but also of practical intelligence, came to believe that Margaret was genuinely haunted, that something had indeed attached itself to the girl through her father's rituals and would not release its claim. She consulted with church authorities, requesting permission to perform an exorcism, but the church was hesitant to officially sanction such a procedure. Exorcism was controversial, rarely performed, and the church hierarchy was unwilling to become involved in a case that had already generated so much scandalous attention. They suggested prayer and patience instead, standard responses that Sister Catherine knew would be inadequate for what Margaret was experiencing. Frustrated by official channels, Sister Catherine took matters into her own hands. She contacted a priest who had experience with cases of spiritual oppression, a Father Michael Brennan, who operated somewhat outside official church approval, but was known to be effective in dealing with genuine supernatural problems. Father Brennan arrived at the facility in October of 1844 and spent several days observing Margaret before attempting any intervention. What he observed convinced him that this was not a simple case of possession, which he had dealt with before, but something more complex and more deeply rooted. Margaret was not possessed in the traditional sense. She retained her own consciousness and will, but she was bound to something, connected by ties that had been forged through ritual and reinforced through trauma until they had become almost physical in nature. Father Brennan's assessment was that Margaret had been made into a spiritual anchor, a living vessel that housed a connection to something that existed in the spaces between life and death. Whether Samuel Thorne was a genuine revenant spirit, a demonic entity wearing a dead man's identity, or some kind of construct created by Reverend Holloway's will and belief made manifest, the result was the same. Margaret was tethered to it, and it was tethered to her, and breaking that tether would require more than simple exorcism prayers. It would require understanding the specific nature of the covenant that had been created and finding a way to dissolve it at its source. Father Brennan spent weeks researching Reverend Holloway's writings, studying the journals and papers that had been seized from the parish house, trying to understand the twisted theology and ritual practices the Reverend had developed. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Holloway had not simply invented his practices from whole cloth. He had drawn from genuine occult traditions, mixing elements of necromancy, ceremonial magic, and corrupted Christian sacraments into something that was technically sophisticated, even as it was morally abhorrent. The marriage ceremony Holloway had performed was not a simple fiction. It had been a real magical working, designed to create a binding that would persist beyond death, beyond time, anchored in both the physical world, through Margaret's living body, and in the spiritual world, through whatever remained of Samuel Thorne. The key to the binding, Father Brennan realized, was the marriage certificate itself. It was not simply a legal document, but a magical instrument, a physical anchor for the spiritual covenant. As long as that document existed, bearing the signatures and seals that had been placed upon it during the ceremony, the binding would remain in force. The document would need to be destroyed, but not simply burned or torn up. It would need to be ritually uncreated, unmade through a counter-ceremony that would reverse the working Reverend Holloway had performed. Father Brennan proposed his solution to Sister Catherine and to the legal authorities who still had jurisdiction over Margaret's case. His proposal was met with skepticism and concern. It seemed dangerously close to endorsing the same kind of occult practices that had created the problem in the first place. But Father Brennan argued that you could not fight fire with silence, that spiritual problems required spiritual solutions, and that Margaret deserved an attempt at freedom, even if that attempt required entering dark territory. After much debate, permission was granted with the condition that everything be carefully documented and that multiple witnesses be present to ensure nothing improper occurred. The ritual was scheduled for the night of December 21st, the winter solstice, a time Father Brennan said would provide the best conditions for severing spiritual bonds. Margaret was brought to a chapel on the facility grounds, a small stone building that had been thoroughly blessed and prepared. The marriage certificate, retrieved from the sealed evidence, was placed on the altar. Margaret stood before it, flanked by Sister Catherine and Father Brennan, with Dr. Harrison and Sheriff Morrison present as witnesses. The ritual Father Brennan performed was complex and lengthy, involving prayers in Latin and Greek, invocations of divine protection, and symbolic reversals of the marriage ceremony's elements. He called upon Margaret to renounce the vows that had been forced upon her, to reject the covenant in her own words, and by her own will. Margaret, now 12 years old and exhausted by months of spiritual siege, spoke the words Father Brennan gave her. She renounced the marriage to Samuel Thorne. She rejected the covenant her father had forged. She declared herself free and unbound. As she spoke, Father Brennan set fire to the marriage certificate, and this was when everything went wrong in ways that everyone present would struggle to articulate for the rest of their lives. The certificate did not burn normally. The flames that consumed it were wrong colors, blues and greens and blacks, that gave off no heat but seemed to pull light into them. The air in the chapel became arctic cold, so cold that everyone's breath became clouds of ice crystals. The candles lighting the space all went out simultaneously, though there was no wind, and in the sudden darkness, something became visible, a figure standing behind Margaret, tall and thin and wearing clothes from another era, its eyes like holes in reality itself. Everyone in the chapel saw it. This was not individual hallucination or suggestible imagination. All 5 witnesses saw the same thing, a presence that had been invisible before, but was now manifest, pulled into visibility by the ritual's disruption of whatever veil had concealed it. The figure rexed for Margaret with hands that seemed to pass through multiple layers of reality at once. Margaret screamed, a sound of pure terror, and the branded mark on her finger split open, blood pouring from the wound in amounts that should not have been possible from such a small injury. Father Brennan continued the ritual, his voice growing louder, more insistent, commanding the entity to release its claim in the name of divine authority. The figure did not leave. Instead, it bent close to Margaret and spoke in a voice that everyone heard not with their ears, but inside their heads. A voice that said, "She is mine." The binding was made in blood and death, and consecrated in ways you cannot undo. I will not release her. I will never release her. She is my wife until death, and I will follow her beyond. Father Brennan seized Margaret's wounded hand and pressed it against a crucifix he had brought, trying to use her blood to create a counter-blessing, a seal that would protect her. The entity recoiled slightly, the figure becoming less solid, but it did not vanish. Instead, it seemed to flow into the shadows at the edges of the chapel, retreating but not departing. The last of the marriage certificate crumbled to ash, the strange flames dying, and the candles reignited all at once, flooding the chapel with light. The figure was no longer visible, but everyone present felt certain it had not truly gone. It had simply become invisible again, returned to whatever liminal space it occupied, but still present, still watching, still claiming ownership of the girl who trembled and bled before the altar. The ritual had failed, or at least had not succeeded in the way they had hoped. The marriage certificate was destroyed, yes, but the binding remained. Whatever connection existed between Margaret and the entity calling itself Samuel Thorne, it was rooted too deeply to be severed by external intervention. Father Brennan, a man who had faced spiritual darkness before and prevailed, admitted defeat. He told Sister Catherine and the others that Margaret would carry this binding for the rest of her life, that the best they could hope for was to teach her how to live with it, how to maintain boundaries and resist when possible, how to endure what could not be escaped. Margaret Holloway remained in the care of the religious facility for 3 more years, until she was 15. During that time, she learned to manage her condition, to function despite the constant presence of her unwanted spiritual husband. She learned which prayers seemed to provide temporary relief, which rituals of protection gave her small spaces of freedom, which times of day and which activities seemed to draw less attention from Samuel. She learned to live a half-life, always aware of being watched, always conscious of the invisible chains that bound her to something that should not exist but did. In 1847, Margaret was released from the facility as a young woman, technically capable of independent living, though everyone involved knew she would never be truly free. She was given a small inheritance from the sale of her father's properties and possessions, enough to support herself modestly. She moved to a different region entirely, seeking anonymity, and for decades she disappeared from official records. The case was sealed, all documents locked away, all witnesses sworn to discretion. The town wanted to forget, and Margaret wanted to be forgotten. But fragments of her story continued to leak out over the years. There were occasional reports, unconfirmed but persistent, of a woman matching Margaret's description, living in various places, always alone, always avoiding deep connections with others. People who claimed to have known her said she never married, despite being attractive and intelligent, because she said she was already married, and her husband was the jealous type. They said strange things happened around her: poltergeist activity, unexplained sounds and movements, as if she carried a haunting with her wherever she went. They said she wore long sleeves always, even in summer, to hide the mark on her finger that never faded, and sometimes appeared to move or change shape under the fabric. The sealed records were finally opened in 1981, after all witnesses to the original events were long dead. Researchers who studied the case were divided in their interpretations. Skeptics argued that Margaret had been so severely traumatized by her father's abuse that she had developed a dissociative disorder, creating the Samuel Thorne personality as a way to process what had been done to her. and that all the supernatural events were either exaggerated in the retelling or explainable through natural phenomena misinterpreted by superstitious observers. Believers argued that the case represented genuine spiritual oppression, that Reverend Holloway had succeeded in binding his daughter to a revenant entity through necromantic practice, and that the consistency of testimony across multiple credible witnesses could not be dismissed as mass delusion. But there was one document in the sealed files that troubled even the most hardened skeptics. It was Margaret's own written testimony, recorded in 1891, just days before her death at age 58. In this final statement, written in a shaky but still legible hand, Margaret described her life after leaving the facility. She described decades of with Samuel's presence, sometimes distant and dormant for months, sometimes overwhelming and inescapable for weeks. She described learning to negotiate with him, to make bargains that would grant her periods of relative peace in exchange for accepting his visits during times she designated. She described the marks that appeared on her body over the years, brands and symbols that manifested without external cause, Samuel's way of marking territory, of ensuring she never forgot to whom she belonged. Most disturbingly, Margaret described in her final testimony what she had come to understand about the true nature of her binding. She wrote that her father had not simply called forth the spirit of Samuel Thorne. He had created something new, something that had used the dead missionary's identity as a framework but was actually constructed from darker materials. Samuel Thorne, the entity that had been bound to her, was partially a revenant spirit, partially a thought form given power through ritual and belief, and partially something else, something that had existed in the spaces between worlds and had been given form and purpose through her father's workings. It was a composite entity, and that was why it could not be banished through conventional means. It existed on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, anchored by the living belief of its victim, fed by fear and trauma, sustained by the magical framework that had been built to contain it. Margaret's final written words were these: "I die knowing that I will not find peace. Samuel has promised that death is not a severance, but a transition, that the covenant extends beyond the grave, that what was begun in life will continue in whatever comes after. I do not know if this is true or if it is another torment he inflicts, but I feel him now, closer than ever, waiting on the threshold. When I cross over, I will learn the final truth of what my father did to me. I will learn if the marriage he forged was truly eternal. I pray for annihilation, for complete cessation, for an end to consciousness rather than continuation in Samuel's embrace. But I deeply fear, that my prayers will go unanswered. Some bindings once forged can never be broken. Some covenants persist, not just beyond death, but beyond time itself. My father believed he was doing holy work, creating a sacred union. I believe he opened a door that should have remained closed and bound his daughter to something that should never have touched the living world. And now I go to discover the cost of his beliefs and the extent of his crimes." Margaret Holloway died on March 3, 1891, in a small rented room in a town whose name she had never revealed to anyone who knew her history. She died alone, as she had lived for decades, though the woman who found her body reported that the room was Arctic cold, despite being fully heated. That marks covered Margaret's exposed skin, as if she had been grabbed and held by multiple hands, and that Margaret's face wore an expression of absolute terror, frozen at the moment of death. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, which was true enough, though what had caused her heart to fail was never determined. The woman also reported one detail that was not included in the official death record, but was mentioned in her private letters to a friend. She said that Margaret's left hand, the one with the burned mark that had never healed, was clenched so tightly closed that it took 2 men to pry the fingers open. When they finally managed to do so, they found Margaret had been clutching something invisible, her fingers wrapped around empty air in the exact position one would use to grip another person's hand. And the branded mark on her finger, which had been a simple circle for 48 years, had changed. It now bore additional symbols, words or letters burned into the flesh around the central ring, written in a language none of the local doctors could identify. One researcher, in studying photographs of Margaret's marked hand taken at the time of her death, claimed to have identified the language as an obscure dialect of medieval Latin, mixed with older Aramaic, the kind of hybrid language that appeared in certain grimoires and books of ceremonial magic. According to this researcher's translation, the words around the ring read, "Bound in life, bound in death, bound beyond death, eternally covenant wed." Whether this translation was accurate or simply another layer of interpretation added to an already convoluted case remains debatable. Margaret Holloway was buried in an unmarked grave, her final resting place kept secret to prevent curiosity seekers and occultists from disturbing her remains. But stories persisted. People claimed to see a woman matching her description in various places, always looking exactly as she had at the time of her death, always wearing long sleeves, always alone but somehow suggesting the presence of another. Some said these were simple cases of mistaken identity, the human mind's tendency to see patterns and familiar faces in strangers. Others argued that Margaret's story had not ended with her death, that the covenant her father had forged was indeed eternal, and that somewhere in the spaces between the living world and whatever lies beyond, a girl who said "I do" at 11 years old continues to be bound to the husband who was created for her through ritual and blood, and the absolute certainty of a madman who believed he was doing God's work. The Holloway case remains one of the most disturbing and inexplicable events in American occult history, a story that raises questions about the nature of reality, the power of belief, the limits of abuse and trauma, and the possibility that some doors once opened can never be fully closed. Whether you believe Margaret was haunted by a genuine supernatural entity or was the victim of psychological damage so severe that it created its own reality, the fact remains that a child was sacrificed on the altar of her father's twisted faith, marked and bound and condemned to a life of fear and isolation. The horror of the Holloway case is not just in the supernatural elements, real or imagined, but in the undeniable human evil at its core, the betrayal of a father who looked at his daughter and saw not a child to protect, but a tool to use in service of his own obsessions. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Holloway case is its ambiguity. We will never know with certainty whether Margaret was genuinely bound to a spiritual entity, or whether she was simply broken so completely that she constructed her own prison from the pieces of her shattered psyche. Both possibilities are equally horrifying. Both speak to violations that transcend the physical, damages that persist beyond the death of the perpetrator. And both suggest that there are forms of abuse and binding that our legal and medical systems are fundamentally unequipped to address, forms of harm that exist in the spaces between the documented and the believed, the provable and the experienced. The marriage certificate is gone, crumbled to ash, in a chapel in 18. Reverend Thomas Holloway is gone, hanged for his crimes and buried in an unmarked grave. Margaret Holloway is gone, dead for over a century, her bones resting in secret earth. But the story persists, passed down through generations, studied by researchers, whispered about in communities that remember. And in the persistence of the story, in the way it continues to disturb and provoke and raise questions that have no comfortable answer, perhaps the binding continues still, not just of Margaret to Samuel Thorne, but of all of us to the recognition that reality is stranger and darker than our frameworks for understanding it can comfortably contain. Some stories do not end when the people in them die. Some covenants, forged in darkness and sealed in suffering, echo through time itself, reminding us that there are depths of human cruelty and cosmic mystery that we may never fully comprehend and perhaps should never fully explore.